This video is sponsored by Rocketman. Check the link in the video description or keep watching to learn more. How should we define different transit modes, and why does any of it matter? Now, if you're wondering why I even want to talk about what the names of modes are, I think it's important that we have global terms. I like to talk about cities around the world, and I like to have terms that I can use to refer to literally anywhere. It's a little frustrating if I have to talk about a system in Europe and always refer to it as a metro, and a system in America and always refer to it as a subway. Or when I'm in Tokyo and it's unclear whether I should refer to an underground rail system as a metro or a subway. Having unifying terms is so important because it helps us distill what the common features of transit modes and lines are. So let's talk about that. I suppose the easiest place to start with the definition of transit modes is with the simplest transit mode: Intercity rail. Intercity is an appropriate term to use for trains which travel between several completely independent cities, or urban areas in general. Hence the term inter. What I would argue though is that once you're talking about a train that connects cities which are all within orbit of one another, basically within a short commuting distance, then you're really looking at a regional train, especially if traveling on a regional scale is the intended use of the service. So no, I don't think the Tokaido Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka is really a regional train just because some people use it for supercommuting. Now let's talk a bit more about regional trains. Something I notice a lot when I talk about rail in places other than North America is that what people refer to as regional rail is often very different. What North Americans often call regional rail, which is literally rail that serves a city and its adjacent suburbs, is what Australians would call suburban rail. The truth is that I think suburban rail is probably a better term for what that is, but it tends to be an unpopular one in North America because in our urbanism and transit spaces, suburbs are seen as really quite terrible in North America. And so calling a form of transit something related to suburbs is generally probably not a very popular idea. Of course, it's not just Australia that calls regional rail that serves larger regions than just cities and their suburbs. That's also the common definition in many places, like for example Europe, where for example the Regiobahn seen in Germany is quite literally that definition of regional rail, whereas S-Bahn trains are more like suburban rail. Now, in other parts of the world, suburban trains are sometimes referred to as commuter. But I really think that this term should be retired unless referring to the almost exclusively North American practice of having trains which operate into the city in the morning and out of the city in the evening, and basically not at all besides that, since such services purely serve 9 to 5 commuters. Proper suburban rail serves far more different types of trips, and its name reflects that more universal nature. Now, RER systems are also really suburban trains, but they refer to ones that tend to operate fairly radially and share a center city tunnel, or potentially several as seen in Paris. S-Bahns tend to be less restrictive. They often also do have center city tunnels, but in places like Berlin, they also often have ring lines. So systems like the London Overground or the Moscow Central Circle and Central Diameters could be called suburban rail or S-Bahns. Now, I did refer to the Marmaray as a metro, and many did argue that it should be called suburban rail. And I'm going to tell you my thoughts on this after a quick message from our sponsor. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be located in a Canadian city, then you should really check out Rocketman this winter, since chances are if you're watching this channel, you're taking public transit on a fairly regular basis. With Canadian winter in full force, an app like Rocketman can be incredibly useful. That way you can check when the next train, bus, streetcar, or light rail vehicle is coming before you step out of your house and completely freeze solid. Of course, you can also use Rocketman to check the departure schedules for your local bus or train stops. And you can stay informed with real-time transit delay information and alerts right inside the app. Of course, you can also know exactly where your bus is with live vehicle locations, so you're always in the know about your transit network. Check out the link in the description down below and download Rocketman for iOS and Android today. Now, I think the Marmaray is more reasonably called a metro than suburban rail for a number of reasons. For one, the trains it uses really make sense for the metro style of operation. super high frequency. And the Marmaray only has 2 tracks for its own operation, and it doesn't have the wide variety of services often seen on suburban rail systems that have more tracks to play with. Now, that's not to say the term suburban rail isn't accurate, because it is, and the Marmaray is suburban rail. It's just also a metro. And I'd argue metro is the most specific or precise term you could use to describe the Marmaray. For example, the London Underground is also clearly a metro, but large sections of it could also be classified as suburban rail. And given that many sections of the London Underground actually do feature quad track, I think suburban rail makes more sense for the London Underground than it does for the Marmaray. Now, defining what a subway or metro or rapid transit is probably deserves its own video, which fortunately I actually made before. My message in that video is that being a metro is more fundamental than what your vehicles look like or what your stations look like. If you operate few service patterns and high frequency service, you're probably a metro. Of course, the term MRT or mass rapid transit is sometimes used in parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia. But lots of forms of transit could be considered mass, so I don't necessarily love using that term. So what about light metro, something I talk about a ton on this channel? Well, to be fair, as I've mentioned in previous videos, light metro is a term that gets abused a bit. I'm still pretty firmly in the camp that believes that a 4 or even 3-car train that's wide enough and has lots of doors should be considered heavy metro. So I'd call that the border region. Of course, nobody, me included in that, would refer to, say, the Canada Line or the Copenhagen Metro with their 40-meter-long trains as heavy metro. But can 70, 80, or 100-meter trains that are quite wide really be called light? Now, of course, LRT is also quite the term to unpack. And I'm going to be honest, I think the confusion caused around the term is kind of seen as a feature by some. When making a favorable comparison, metro systems are often referred to as LRT or light rail. I've heard that with regard to the Vancouver SkyTrain frequently, where people call it light rail. At the same time, systems that definitely resemble the average LRT system are often not referred to as LRT when they're seen as having negative features. So a lot of systems get called trams or streetcars if they don't meet the vague definition for light rail. Basically, the imprecision of LRT as a term probably isn't an accident. Now, I'd argue that broadly, any train system which features train cars that don't have shared bogies probably shouldn't be referred to as LRT. Of course, I would generally avoid using the term LRT. At best, it's unclear what you're describing, and at worst, it feels that you're purposely obfuscating what you're trying to talk about. If your trains spend most of their times on or adjacent to a street, you should probably call them a tram, and if they mix with traffic, call them a streetcar. If they use rail corridors for any substantial distance, call them tram trains. And if they use significant city center tunnels and other grade separation, call them Stadtbahns. Of course, if an LRT is fully grade separated, you should probably call it a light metro, as Ottawa's system clearly is. Of course, for any light rail line, there may be a few distinct sections, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong to call it a hybrid between X and Y. For example, the Eglinton Crosstown in Toronto is clearly a subway for part of its length, and a tram for another part of its length, so it's a bit of a subway-tram hybrid. Now, you didn't expect me not to talk about buses, did you? Local bus routes can be called local bus routes, or buses. But where things unsurprisingly get much more confusing is BRT. The first thing I'll say is if you have a few nice shelters and maybe some queue jump lanes, you're still really talking about buses, just better buses. But I would say you are BRT light. Systems are kind of like suburban rail or the New York subway, but with buses, with lots of stations, services, and bypass lanes. Transitways distinguish themselves from standard BRTs by having higher top speeds and alignments more similar to rail. So why does any of this actually matter? People are often overly pedantic, but I like to say that the service doesn't lie. Terms are often thrown around by politicians or planners in order to sell people on a certain idea or to be purposefully vague. I remember going to a public meeting at one point where a planner told me and my focus group of people that BRT had the same capacity as a metro, even though obviously BRT doesn't have the level of capacity of a metro if you can't have a very large corridor, which the street we were talking about didn't. It's this sort of abuse of the vagueness of different terms for modes in transit that is really frustrating and doesn't help people understand what transit actually looks like and how it functions in our cities. And so this is why the terminology we use and what we call modes is so important. Thanks for watching.